All right, thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm Christine Tobin, Manager of Customer Success at WiBot. As a customer of WiBot, we not only want to assist you with our IoT sensor technology and support from our team of Wi-Fi engineers, but we also want to provide training opportunities. Today, we look forward to spending the next hour with you, providing valuable information about best practices in Wi-Fi. We'll continue to host ongoing training webinars based on different topics in Wi-Fi, so stay tuned. There are more sessions to come. As you know, Wi-Fi networks have grown more critical for student learning and business operations. Wi-Fi networks have also grown more complex. We understand how critical Wi-Fi is an imperative to the success of a network's operations. Our goal today is to take the collective learnings from our customers and provide an overview of industry best practices in Wi-Fi so that we can equip you with information and knowledge to help you optimize your network for your students, for your teachers, and for your administration. Joining me today are my colleagues, Jacob and Adam Wilson, who have many years of experience in the Wi-Fi industry. On a daily basis, they work with and support our education customers. Throughout the webinar, should you have questions, please use the Q&A feature, and Jacob and Adam will answer your questions as we go along. At the conclusion of our session, we'll allow for some Q&A time as well. So to start, Jacob will review the technical portion, best practices in Wi-Fi, and then Adam will review one of our newest features, which is SAML authentication, and also show you where to find helpful information on your dashboard. So please enjoy this session. And Jacob, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Chris. So yeah, I'm going to get started here by sharing my screen. All right, screen share has begun. Let me know if that's showing up. Is that there?
Looks good. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, so again, thanks everybody for hopping on this webinar. Yeah, so today the topics we're going to run through are really Wi-Fi fundamentals and best practices. So we're going to talk a little bit about the technology and talk about how you can apply that and improve your networks by following some industry kind of standard best practices that we always recommend. All right, so moving on here, the topics we're going to cover today. So we'll start by talking about, what actually is Wi-Fi. So some basic, definitions, the evolution of Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi, as many of you know, has come a long way, right? The technology always evolves. So we're going to talk about some of the different standards that are out there so you can understand, a little bit more about what that means. We'll talk about the fact that Wi-Fi is actually a shared medium, which is a very important concept to understand. It's when you're optimizing your network. Now, common causes of interference, that's another topic, very important, as well as reducing interference, right? So with your WiBot sensors, you have spectrum analysis, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why interference is problematic. Then we're going to talk about some of the channel planning and your design considerations, meaning, looking at 2.4 versus 5 gig, looking at the DFS channels, which is something that applies to the 5 gigahertz band. And it's, again, an important concept that I think everybody should be aware of. Channel bonding, which is something that you can do to achieve higher data rates at a cost, which we'll talk about. And then finally, reviewing was just some best practice bullet points to wrap everything up. All right, so getting started here, the first slide is what actually is Wi-Fi, right? So just a basic definition, right? Wi-Fi, the word Wi-Fi, well, it's not an acronym, actually. It's it really is just branding. It's a brand name that was created by the Wi-Fi Alliance back in the early days. Now there's some arguments back and forth around whether or not it's based off of the term hi-fi, high fidelity. It's a little dubious in my opinion. I think it's, as far as I know, it's just a word that's catchy, right? And the reason they use that word is because the real name of Wi-Fi is actually IEEE 802.11, which I would say most people, especially, the standard consumer is not going to remember that. And I think we can all agree that Wi-Fi has been a very successful brand name because it's one of the most prevalent technologies in use today in just about every, electronic device. Right, so the way Wi-Fi works is it's going to use radio waves to encode data. So the ones and zeros that your computers are going to understand, that has to get encoded using the wireless medium, with a transmitter and a receiver radio. And you can kind of see just a very basic visualization, and we're not going to get very in depth on the, the modulation technology and all of that, but just to kind of understand, right, what it really does is you take a frequency, a specific, hertz frequency, and you're going to manipulate the way that that's transmitted. So by adjusting things like phase, amplitude, etc., to encode a stream of data, right? So Wi-Fi totally over the air, right? And that's a very important, differentiator between, Ethernet, for example, and we'll talk about that in a second. So just to give you this sort of basic visualization, that's kind of how that all works. And what I'll say is Wi-Fi is the access layer, right? It's at this point, most devices, most end user devices are connecting to your network over Wi-Fi. So, that contrasts that to the old days where it was a switch, right? And everybody could plug into the switch and then they get online, and, generally speaking, that worked a lot more consistently, right? But now that Wi-Fi is the access layer, I think it's important that everybody understands at least some fundamentals about how that technology works. All right, so to compare and contrast a little bit between Wi-Fi and Ethernet, well, first of all, Wi-Fi is 802.11, right? Ethernet's 802.3, so they're, not the same thing. They're not the same technology by any means. They have the same end goal, typically, to get somebody connected to a network, but very, very different in a lot of ways, right? Now, one of them is that Wi-Fi is a half duplex technology, right? Comparing to Ethernet, which is typically full duplex, unless you're talking about a hub from the olden days. Hopefully nobody has any hubs in their environments anymore. But so that means, Wi-Fi only really supports kind of one-way communication, right? It's AP to client, client to AP, one client at a time. And that's pretty much it, right? It's also unbounded, right? So you compare it to Ethernet. Well, that's, copper cables in a little plastic tube, right? So it's very easy, I think, on Ethernet to have a consistent, connection, because that's the only, the only information traveling on that medium versus being over the air, right? You have to contend with not only Wi-Fi, neighboring devices, etc. So we'll talk more about that later on here, but that's an important differentiator. And as I mentioned, right, it's one device at a time. Now, there are some newer technologies with Wi-Fi 6 that do allow, technically, you can transmit from an AP to multiple clients at once using some multiplexing technology, but I'll say that is, just these days, it's kind of few and far between, because most devices are still AC or older. So as long as you're using one of those older technologies, it's very much a one device gets to talk at a time. So I really wanted to drive that home. That's an important concept to understand when you're thinking about a Wi-Fi network. And we'd also talk about the data rates, right? The speed of Wi-Fi, very, kind of big topic, right? Everybody talks about how fast your Wi-Fi is. Well, it's kind of a complicated answer, right? So comparing to Ethernet, well, Ethernet's going to use a fixed speed, right? You have your 100 meg switches, gigabit switches, 10 gigabit switches, right? But the point being is when you connect a device to that switch, and if all goes well with cabling, et cetera, it's going to connect at a speed like a gigabit. It's going to negotiate to that speed, and it'll stick to that. So all the transmissions between the end and end to end there are going to be at that negotiated speed, right? Well, comparing that to Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi has hundreds and hundreds of data rates that depend on a whole variety of factors. Things like how many spatial streams the client radio has, right? There's 1x1 clients, 2x2 clients, some high-end 3x3 clients. Those are going to have totally different, speeds they use, the channel bonding, the guard interval, lots and lots of metrics. So if you're curious, there's this website called mcsindex.com. And you're going to look at that website and you'll be like, oh my goodness, this is a lot of information, because it's a spreadsheet that has all of the Wi-Fi data rates. And really the point I want to cover here is this is not a constant thing, right? A client and an AP, they're going to constantly shift their data rate, just depending on a whole variety of factors, right? And also client drivers. It's different per client how they're going to do this, but a lot of times maybe it's they tried to send a frame and it doesn't get received, so they're going to shift the rate down and to hopefully get a better connection. So the point being is Wi-Fi is not going to be consistent with its performance. It just won't, right? I mean, it's generally pretty good these days if you have a well-designed network. But what I'd recommend, though, if you have a device that's not going to move, plug it in with a wire, right? That's the advice you're getting from a Wi-Fi engineer, because that is, the fact of the matter is you want to whenever you can, use that Ethernet cabling, connect your devices, just to keep the Wi-Fi, you know, cleaner for the devices that do need it, right? So moving on, we'll talk about the evolution a little bit of Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi has come a long way, right? It's been on the market not all that long, honestly. I mean, since about 1999 was when Wi-Fi really first, you know, came to market and started, you know, having some, you know, some uptake. And the technology's changed quite a lot over the years. So we'll talk about initially when Wi-Fi came out, there was this technology called 802.11b. Now the Wi-Fi Alliance decided to go back and rename all these to something more understandable to most people. So we have Wi-Fi 1 is what you might call this instead. So that came out in 1999, and it only operated on the 2.4 band, actually. So when Wi-Fi was first around, the 2.4 band was very much dominant for a number of reasons, you know, one of them being that the technology was cheaper, right? It was less expensive to manufacture the technology needed for that. So 2.4 was kind of where Wi-Fi lived, and that was okay back then because Wi-Fi really wasn't very, you know, very common, right? It was versus coverage-based thing, right? That's all you care about is getting signal strength. So you see here that operated at a 22 megahertz channel list, which is kind of weird compared to everything else. And it has very, very low speeds, right? A maximum speed of 11 megabits per second. So that's a legacy technology, and we'll talk more about why you shouldn't support B, but we're well past that. B has been deprecated really since 2003 here when 11G came out, because that's when they kind of took the technology that was existing already on 5 gig, but not very popular with A, and they moved it to the 2.4 band. So it fixed a lot of stuff that was problematic with that B technology. So anyway, moving on, right? We went to N, you know, in 2009. That's where we introduced something called channel bonding, which is a very, very important concept now. You know, in a modern network, you know, you can do 40 megahertz channels, 80 megahertz channels. Doesn't mean you should do it, right? But you can, and that's, you know, a way to get really, really high data rates. Same thing with some new modulation technologies that were introduced, which we're not going to talk about, but that's kind of what happens every time a new standard comes out. They're going to introduce, you know, maybe new modulation, maybe some new kind of manipulation of the standard. So here, you know, you see AC, then you could do 80 megahertz channels, you know, AX, then you could do some really crazy stuff like, you know, 10 gigabits per second, right? I mean, and these speeds down here, by the way, this is like maximum theoretical data rate that you can negotiate if you have two of the most expensive, most fancy radios talking to each other. In reality, you know, client devices are nowhere near, you know, what you're going to see with this, right? I mean, and also this is just the data rate, which is nothing. It's not the same thing as the actual throughput. It's the throughput's usually about half of the data rate that you see, just as a rule of thumb. So don't think you're going to start getting, you know, 10 gigabit per second just because you put in Wi-Fi 6 APs. I mean, that'd be nice, but it's just not realistic, right? You know, and then you know, 6E, we'll talk about that a little bit. That's 6 gigahertz. That's you know, a very big deal actually, because that's a huge amount of frequency space that just got you know, unlocked for the United States to use. So that's very exciting. You know, definitely a developing technology in a lot of ways. And then, you know, going forward, right? You know, what's going to be next? Well, there's a standard called 802.11be, which is, you know, colloquially known as Wi-Fi 7. To be honest, right, we don't know a ton about it yet. It's still in development. You know, and maybe in 2024 we're going to hear something about it. Maybe not. But anyway, the point being is Wi-Fi is going to continue to evolve, right? And you're going to have to be aware of that as technology improves. You need to refresh your access points, refresh your clients, and go from there, right? So kind of some best practices around this, right? So Wi-Fi is backwards compatible, is what I want to make clear, right? So all these standards that you see, you know, the idea is if you have a Wi-Fi 6 AP, it should be able to support a client all the way back to, you know, 1999 Wi-Fi 1. But there is a cost to that in some ways, right? So what we'd advise you kind of just based on what we've seen is you should disable support for B, honestly. I mean, B is so old that, you know, I mean, for example, you're in a school, right? Your students, none of your students would have been born, you know, when B was still on the market, right? So you shouldn't have to support that standard, but it's probably on by default in a lot of cases. So what you can do is to disable legacy data rates, 1, 2, 5.5, 11 megabits per second. And that's going to really help, right? Because you don't want to be supporting legacy rates. It's going to slow everything else down. All your management traffic is going to get sent at a really slow speed, which is just unnecessary, you know. So recommend doing that. And, you know, just to make it clear, right, with B, for those that remember, that's back when you had to use a PCM card on your laptop to connect to Wi-Fi. So here's a an old Netgear 802.11b PCM card, right? This is a, if you remember how old this is, right? I think that's going to give you an idea of why you don't need to support this technology anymore. Now, another point I'll say is when you upgrade APs, that's really only part of your network refresh, right? If you're really trying to upgrade your Wi-Fi and get to the newest standards, because the clients are part of your network as well, right? And client devices need to support the newest standards to take advantage of that technology. So if you have an AC client on a Wi-Fi 6 AP, well, that's not really going to take advantage of the new enhancements to the standard that Wi-Fi 6 introduced. So when you do that refresh, just look at your client devices, and if you can, get involved in that procurement process, right? Find out from the vendor, look at the spec sheet, make sure that those devices are supporting a reasonable kind of Wi-Fi technology. For new devices, they should be Wi-Fi 6 whenever you can, at the very least. So what I'll say is a modern device, typically what you're going to see these days, a lot of AC still. So that was the standard since 2013. So you still see a lot of AC out there, which is a fine standard. Honestly, it's still very efficient and effective. But newer devices are Wi-Fi 6, right? That's been on the market for a few years now. So you're going to see a lot more of that. And then also some higher end devices that you might see. Well, those could be 6 gigahertz, which are great. And I would definitely recommend, if you can, purchase those, because if you get the Wi-Fi 6, or the 6E 6 gigahertz APs, you can really take advantage of that new spectrum that's going to be available to you. All right, so looking on your YBot dashboard, there's some signatures under the issue detail section that may be relevant to you kind of in regards to these topics. So, one signature we do point out is oftentimes, we may see a legacy device, and our engine's kind of looking for things like that. So here's a case where this might be a printer or something like that. But we're pointing out this is an AG kind of data rate device. So it only supports up to 54 megabits per second. And our advice when you see devices like that is you should upgrade them, right? I mean, that means this device and a theoretical kind of speed test, right? It might get 25 megabits per second on the high end. It's also going to slow down all your neighbors, right? Because this device just takes longer to transmit. So something to be aware of, you might see that. Also, I'll say another very common issue we run into is this, where there's legacy data rates enabled on your network. So here we see an alert pointing out there's a lot of APs that support these B rates, 1, 2, 5.5, 11. And our advice, whenever you can, especially if it's your APs, you should disable support for these rates, just to get everything more efficient and not support legacy technology that doesn't really need to be there. All right. So let's move on, right? The next topic is a concept, really, that I want to make sure everybody understands. And Wi-Fi is a shared medium. So what I mean by that is Wi-Fi uses the air, right? It's the RF space around you, and it's an unbounded, kind of unlicensed area where anybody honestly can use it. It's just the way it works. So you have to contend with that. So everything in those frequencies that you're using can use some of the airtime. It can cause interference and cause issues for you. And those things include typically, nearby access points or wireless networks. Typically with the 5 gigahertz band, that's a lot of what you're going to see is, nearby APs maybe stepping on the same channels that you're using, and we'll talk about ways you can optimize for that. Non-Wi-Fi devices. So this is especially prevalent in the 2.4 band. So if we're talking about things like Bluetooth, maybe analog cameras, cordless phones, things like that, those use that 2.4 spectrum typically. And it's not the Wi-Fi protocol. So it's essentially just going to be noise to any device trying to transmit there. And also just raw energy. So some devices just radiate RF just because of the nature of how they work. So a microwave oven is an example of that. That uses the 2.4 band to heat up food. And that's just because that happens to resonate with water molecules, right? So when you are running a 2.4 gigahertz kind of frequency at 1,000 watts, that's enough to heat up food pretty quickly. But if your microwave is not perfectly sealed, if the door is a little bit leaky or it's an older model, you may find when it operates, it actually radiates RF pretty strongly into the environment, and that may cause performance issues, for 2.4 devices. So here's a little illustration of that, right? You can see all the different things under the cloud, the Wi-Fi medium that you have to contend with. And as you can see, it's not just APs, right? There's lots of other devices involved with that. So yeah, and an important concept with this shared medium stuff is that, the metric that a lot of devices are going to look at, and you should also look at when you're looking at the health of a network, is something called airtime utilization, right? So here's just a visualization of the WiBot dashboard where we have our airtime utilization on one of the sensors. We see channel 1's at 81%. So this is exceptionally high airtime. And that means there's only 19% of the airtime available for a device to transmit a frame, right? And that just is going to slow down the network like crazy and introduce a lot of issues, a lot of retries, things like that are going to start happening. Channel 100, 5 gig you're seeing is very clean, 2%, right? So as the airtime gets higher, right, the performance is going to get worse. So it's important to keep an eye on this and optimize your network and avoid interferers, things like that, to get this airtime use as low as you possibly can. All right, so we're going to talk now about some common sources of interference that you'll see, or causes of interference, I suppose, when in regards to Wi-Fi. So there's 3 types of interference, right? You have co-channel interference, adjacent channel interference, and then, non-Wi-Fi interference, right? So co-channel interference, that's when you have neighboring APs on the same channel, right? And that's certainly not uncommon, right? And the problem with co-channel interference is really what you're doing is just making the Wi-Fi less efficient. Because that means, for example, all the devices on channel 11, they may have to, if they hear multiple APs on channel 11, that means they have to wait for those clients to stop transmitting. And that's just inefficient, right? I mean, in a perfect world, every AP gets to use its own unique channel, and it only has to worry about the clients that are connected directly to it. But when you have co-channel interference, you're kind of extending that coverage a little bit, and that runs into, you run into airtime issues and things of that nature. So you want to avoid that whenever possible. Now, adjacent channel interference is a little bit interesting, right? So this is exclusive to the 2.4 band. And we're going to talk more about why that is, but there are some channels on the 2.4 band that actually step on each other. So channel 2 and 4 and 6, for example, all 3 of these channels are going to step on each other. And the problem with that is that if I'm a client on channel 6, and I can hear channel 2 and channel 4, well, I'm not tuned to that channel, so I don't really understand, what they're saying. I just hear the raw kind of noise, the raw energy. And the problem with that is that's very destructive. You can run into a lot of data collisions there. Devices are a little bit less careful when there's a, just raw, energy out there. So it's very bad. So you want to avoid it. And it's easily avoidable. You just don't want to use any channels other than 1, 6, or 11. And we'll talk more about that later on here. And then finally, non-Wi-Fi interference. So this is when you run into those devices, the phones, cameras, microwaves, Bluetooth, etc. Again, primarily 2.4. Actually, the 5 gig doesn't have a lot of that, other than radar, to be honest. But that's some the different terms you're going to hear: co-channel, adjacent channel, and then non-Wi-Fi interference. So looking at a WiBot signature to help you understand this. So you may log in your dashboard and see this where there's non-Wi-Fi interference detected, and you expand that and you'll see our spectrum analyzer, right? That's what's doing this. We're picking up, in this case, a microwave oven was operating. You see it affected multiple channels. We have the start and end time of the events recorded for you. And then our solution is very much, you got to find these devices and remove them, right? I mean, unfortunately, that's about all you can do, other than kind of changing the channels your APs are using to get out of the way of these devices. So that's just some visualization of that for you. And yeah, so let's talk about some ways you can optimize the network to reduce some of this interference. So as I talked about, APs on the same channel, that's going to cause co-channel interference. And this is especially a problem on 2.4. 5 gig, you have a lot more channels to use, so you can oftentimes get around that. But let's just for the sake of simplicity, we could look at 2.4 because there's only 3 channels. So we got a couple of visualizations here, right? So the one on the left, this is the perfect world Wi-Fi deployment, right? And I can understand it's not so easy on 2.4 to have this deployment, just the nature of how far these signals really travel. But let's just say you can have an environment where, this AP here on channel 11, you see none of the channels nearby are interfering. None of them are the same channel. And that's what you want to have. You want to have a kind of a honeycomb type structure where you're reusing channels as efficiently as you can. You're staggering them so you don't have channels, the same channels being used. Another thing I'll say is your power levels, right? You want to make sure to set your power levels suitably for your environment to minimize, the expansion of the coverage beyond where it needs to be. So a lot of schools may have 1 AP in every classroom, right? And in those cases, you want to drop your power levels considerably because, that AP only needs to service the clients in the classroom, basically. And you don't want to have it extending into neighboring classrooms and potentially being on the same channel as another access point. So here's a visualization of that, right? We have maybe somebody crank the power on this 1 AP or these 2 APs because maybe there was a coverage hole. But now what we ran into is now there's co-channel interference, right? These 2 APs on the same channel. So it's a difficult balancing act. Don't get me wrong. And oftentimes you need to use your controller's kind of intelligent technology to leverage that and have them automatically adjust power levels. But this is just kind of a visualization of the channel planning process. All right, so speaking a little bit more about transmit power now. So that's really, where you are going to determine kind of how far an AP is going to transmit signal. And, in the old days of Wi-Fi, right, the goal was to get coverage. You wanted to have Wi-Fi coverage everywhere in your building because you only had a couple devices using Wi-Fi. And the main thing was they were able to stay connected everywhere. But in modern networks, you have a lot more APs than that. And coverage is not your goal, it's capacity, right? You want to have your APs able to service as many clients as possible. So yeah, I mean, you can do a couple things, right? You can, what I recommend in a lot of cases is set a range of power on your wireless controller. So a lot of them let you do something like, say, 5 dBm to 11 dBm. That's my range for my 2.4 radios. And then, your APs get some room to play with because it's, the RF's a very dynamic environment. So you can let the APs adjust to find the optimal level. But you do want to limit it from going too high because too high, you're going to start running into co-channel interference. You're going to run into roaming issues, especially because a client device is not going to want to roam until it can't see an AP at a reasonable signal strength, right? So, for example, a device may not roam until it's at minus 75 dBm. And if you have an AP set to 25 dBm on transmit power, well, that AP may have that signal strength all the way down to the end of the hall, and that client may have passed 3 or 4 APs that would have been way better to connect to. So that's a case when you really want to make sure, lower is generally speaking, and again, it's just general, right? But in most circumstances, we recommend using a lower power level, especially on 2.4, right? You want to keep that as low as you reasonably can because, it's very difficult to minimize the the co-channel interference. So you want to do whatever you can there to improve that. All right, so kind of looking at some of these signatures about the channel planning and interference. So one of them you're going to see is this, where there may be neighboring APs on the same channel. So here we see channel 6 is being used by 10 APs in the same neighborhood. And when you see things like that, you kind of just think about what you can do, right? Again, dropping power, as we talked about. In some cases, you may need to actually strategically disable certain 2.4 radios to help with that. And then you see this on the 5 gig band. Oftentimes it's because you're using too wide of a channel width, or you're not using the DFS channels, because it's a common issue to see, right? People will be, using too wide of a channel for their environment, and then you just run into channel overlap in a big way. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and that's where we're going to kind of focus on. We'll talk a little bit about 6 gigahertz, but since it's such a new technology and not honestly all that prevalent quite yet, we'll focus here, right? And most networks, contend with these 2 bands. And the point I really want to drive home here is that the 2.4 band is something you really shouldn't have to support as much as you think you do. And there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to support 2.4, but just this little visualization here maybe can help you understand. You have a very limited bandwidth on 2.4. So if we're talking cars on a highway, right, maybe it's a 3-lane road, on a interstate, right? So it's nowhere near enough capacity. So you're going to run into congestion since there's such a limited bandwidth. Moving to 5 gig, though, you'll see you have a lot more bandwidth, right? So let's just say hypothetically, this is just an illustration. And honestly, if we're going to do this to scale, right, this 5 gig road would be much, much wider compared to 2.4. But just for the practicality's sake, right, you can kind of see that the 5 gig band has a lot more bandwidth to use. So you're going to have more capacity for the traffic, on your Wi-Fi network. All right, so talking a little bit about 2.4 here. So the 2.4 band has a very small amount of bandwidth, around 100 megahertz, give or take, right? Which is a lot less than 5 gigahertz. And it's also contested because there's, 2.4 is used for not only Wi-Fi, lots of other devices use that band, as we kind of discussed, right? So what you get with 2.4 in North America is you get about 11 channels to use, which, you think you can use those channels, but the answer is you cannot. You cannot use all 11 channels. You can use 3 channels, 1, 6, or 11. And to help you understand that, we have this kind of graph here, this little visualization of the 2.4 band. So here you see a 22 megahertz channel width. So assuming you have B support on, it's about that. And the ones on highlighted are 1, 6, and 11. And as we can see, these are really the only 3 channels. I mean, it's the best 3 channels you can use because they don't step on each other, right? So if I pick channel 3, for example, you see it steps on channel 1, it steps on channels all the way up to, looks like channel 7 here, right? So this is something you don't want to use. You don't want to use channel 3. Now you could make an argument that, well, okay, maybe channel 3 and channel 8, for example. Well, those channels don't overlap, so you could use them both. But the problem there is you only have 2 channels, right? You don't have 3, so that's a lot worse. The other thing is your neighbors are most likely using 1, 6, or 11, so you should also use 1, 6, or 11 to avoid, having that adjacent interference, which we talked about, which is a lot worse than co-channel interference. So that's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. So you have those 3 channels to use. It's heavily utilized by non-Wi-Fi devices, right? Your microwave ovens, your Bluetooth, your cordless phones, et cetera, et cetera. And, the devices that are still using 2.4 these days, because it is still out there, right? I mean, smart bulbs, IoT devices, especially. So low-cost devices or low-energy devices that want to have a cheap Wi-Fi radio, you will still see some 2.4, unfortunately. So you may have to support it, but what I'd say is your capacity to support it should be pretty limited. These days, devices that users interact with are typically going to be 5 gig capable, unless you're talking very, very low cost devices. I know there can be some Chromebooks out there that support 2.4 only. I hope you don't have those in your environment. And, if you are purchasing them, Chromebooks, don't save the money on the Wi-Fi radio because that's going to cause a lot of headaches for you trying to support those on your network. But yeah, primarily 5 gig is where users should be, and we'll show you that here. So here's the 5 gig band. Another chart, and what you can see here is all these little triangles on this chart are the 20 megahertz channels. So we can see here that you have a lot more channels. You have 25 total channels here in the US. And that's obviously more than 3, right? So you have a lot more room to play around with. And something else, just to be clear, is adjacent channel interference is really not as much, or it's not really a problem at all on the 5 gig band. So, for example, channel 36 and 40, they don't step on each other, right? It's not like channel 1 and 2 on 2.4. So just to be clear, right, you don't have to stagger like you would on the 2.4 band. You can use all these channels, right? So something that's interesting about the 5 gig band is there's a technology known as channel bonding, which you can use, actually. You can get away with channel bonding a little bit on 5 gig, and that could be nice if you need to get very high bandwidth. In most cases, you actually don't need high bandwidth, or very high bandwidth, I'll say. So that's something to be aware of. But you see here how that looks. You have the, and we'll talk more about this later, but you have the, 40 megahertz, 80 megahertz, and 160, which you shouldn't ever use, but that's how that works. You're sticking channels together. So you also have less congestion from non-Wi-Fi, and because that's just, there's not a lot of non-Wi-Fi devices there. There's radar. Radar is prevalent in some circumstances, but not all that common. And then modern devices, I kind of said, so those devices your users, use to get on the internet, they're typically going to support 5 gig. So that's what I'd say is for those SSIDs you have that are only, for your clients, oftentimes you can just disable support for 2.4, and that will, fix most of your problems in a lot of cases, if you get this very clean band to use. All right, so here we look here at this DFS channels. This is a very important concept with the 5 gig band. So we have this little red box we highlighted around these channels. These are all DFS. All right, so when I say DFS, it's called dynamic frequency selection, and it's a technology, or it's a set of channels really that was introduced or for Wi-Fi sometime in the 2009-ish time frame. And one fact about this is 64% of the 5 gig channels are within this range. So most of your bandwidth is within DFS. And a lot of times these channels are not enabled, right? They oftentimes are disabled by default on your wireless controller config. Sometimes that's just because you know, they want optimal compatibility for every possible client out of the box. But also I'll say is some newer APs. So when you buy a brand new access point, there can be a backlog on the certification to actually use these channels by the FCC. It's a little bit of a different process to get access to use them for the vendors. So sometimes you actually can't use the channels until a new firmware version comes out that unlocks the support for DFS. But we recommend using these channels whenever you can, right? Because as I said, it's most of the bandwidth. And you know, once you unlock these channels, you'll find you have a lot more flexibility with your configuration to avoid, you know, interference and things like that. So something that can happen with DFS, I talked a little bit about radar. So it's pretty rare to see an actual radar event, to be honest. It is possible to see a false positive. So APs they're very sensitive and they can think something's radar when it's not. And when a radar event happens and an AP's on, let's just pretend channel 100, for example, it has to change its channel. So maybe it'll go to channel 44 or something. It'll have to stay off of channel 100 for a half hour before returning. So that's called a DFS event. And what I would say is turn on the DFS channels and look at your wireless controller. It should log when a DFS event happens. And if you're seeing them frequently, you know, maybe you can consider not using DFS channels, but in most cases, you're totally fine to get away with these and, you know, take advantage of all that spectrum. So very important to be aware of. Now I'll quickly talk about 6 gigahertz a little bit. So this is kind of the newest technology you probably heard about. Wi-Fi is 6E, which is the 6 gigahertz band basically. So it's still using Wi-Fi 6 technology. It just has a different spectrum to play around with. And you get 59 20 megahertz channels, which is an unbelievable amount of bandwidth. So that's more than double what you have of 5 gigahertz, which is great because then you can design your networks. You have a lot of flexibility there. So kind of interesting, you know, challenges of 6 gigahertz. So in the outdoor side of it, it actually uses the same frequency space as some cell towers. So the outdoor 6 gigahertz deployments are still really in development. The FCC hasn't, as far as I know, given the go-ahead quite yet for vendors to start deploying those APs. But that's just an interesting challenge, you know, with vendors, how they're going to handle that, you know, coexistence. Indoors, not so much of a problem. Now, a 6 gigahertz AP is typically going to be a tri-band access point, meaning it supports 2.4, 5 gig, and 6 gig. An important thing with that, you know, that many radios is a lot of times those APs are going to require more power than your network may just support, just with the switches you have now. So sometimes you may need to purchase those 802.3 BT switches. Some people call it PoE++, right? But that's that new 90 watt PoE standard. So just keep an eye, you know, if you're purchasing 6E access points, make sure you look at the spec sheet. And if they require that BT power, you know, you may need to purchase switches as well. You know, because otherwise those APs are going to downgrade their performance if they're not getting that full power that they require. All right, so another concept here is channel bonding. I know I've alluded to it quite a lot now. So let's talk about more of that in detail, right? So what you're doing with channel bonding is you're combining multiple 20 megahertz channels together into 40 megahertz, 80 megahertz, and 160 megahertz. Don't use 160 megahertz, but you can theoretically do it. And the reason for that is you get more data rate, right? You can technically double the data rate. You go from 20 to 40, which sounds great, but the problem is you often run into channel overlap, which basically defeats all the purpose of having the higher data rate. So that's what I'd say is you know, with 20 megahertz, this is what I recommend as a default setting for most people, because what you get is 25 channels, which is quite a lot. Now there's this parenthesis here. This is without DFS. So if you don't want to run DFS, you're going down to 9 channels, right? So you really are limiting that quite a lot. And that's the best for your high density deployments. And, you know, just to be clear, right? Your network is probably a high density network. If you're in a school, it's high density because every user has at least one device, sometimes even multiple devices. So if every AP is supporting 40, 50 clients, you know, you're in a high density network and you should be using 20 megahertz, right? If you go to 40 megahertz, you see what we run into now is you're cutting the number of channels in half. So you have only 12 channels now, which is, it can be enough in some circumstances, right? But oftentimes it's not enough. And we see here this, without DFS, you go down to 4, which is almost never going to be enough channels for any network. So what I'd say is if you're not running your DFS channels, just don't use 40, don't even bother with it, go down to 20. So this can be useful for low density environments, or if you're in a case where you just need extremely excessively high throughput, maybe you're in an AutoCAD lab or you're sending big files over the Wi-Fi, sure. I would say in most cases you don't need to use 40 though, I would go 20. Then you have 80 megahertz, just don't use it in enterprise, it doesn't scale, you're bonding too many channels together and you're only down to 6, and without DFS only 2, which is just nowhere near enough channels, right? Then 160 megahertz, don't use it, just don't do it. Unless you like bad Wi-Fi, I would say don't even think about turning on 160. So that's the channel bonding concept there. And here's a signature to kind of show you that. So one thing we can point out is if you're not using an optimal channel plan, and that may be down to channel bonding, right? So here's a case where we see, we're using 80 megahertz channel width, which is very wide, and also we're not using DFS. So we only have 2 channels to use. So our signature is kind of saying, hey, you should really consider turning DFS and dropping that channel width to avoid, this type of issue. So you may see that on your dashboard when you take a look. All right, so just wrapping this up here, we have some bullet points to kind of refresh on the topics. So, and I think one of the main things I want to drive home is your Wi-Fi is not the only thing out there on the airwaves. You have your neighbors, you have, non-Wi-Fi devices, et cetera. So, for your own sake and the performance of your network, just remember these things. You should disable your legacy data rates, meaning B. So disable those legacy 802.11b rates to make sure your network is as efficient as it should be, and you don't have to support these old technologies. This is ancient, right? You don't need to bother with that. Make sure your client devices are up to date. So if you've done a network refresh recently, take a look at the client device inventory. You may have some devices that are still, G, and if that's the case, I mean, those devices are really not going to get any performance improvement from a new AP. They're just going to need to be replaced or, give them an adapter or something. Analyze your network for sources of interference. So, take a look at your WiBot sensors and your RF analytics and see if you're picking up any non-Wi-Fi interference, your microwaves or Bluetooth. I'm not saying you can just get rid of all that stuff very easily, but at least have some awareness of what's in your environment. So you maybe know what channels you can or can't use, or, maybe you just need to disable 2.4 because it's just too messy with all the interference. Set the appropriate transmit power for your coverage area. So as we kind of talked about, you probably have a smaller coverage cell than you might think. If you have an AP in every classroom, you should drop that transmit power considerably in order to improve roaming performance and avoid co-channel interference. Use the 5 gigahertz band, right? So really, if you can shut off 2.4, more power to you. We really recommend just getting away from 2.4 wherever possible. So make your, your primary SSIDs where your clients are getting connected, make those 5 gig only if you can. You can keep a 2.4 support around for maybe an IoT network or something like that. But for critical applications, you should really only have those clients on 5 gig. And then also use only a wide the channel as you need. Right. And in most cases, that is going to be 20 megahertz. If you are thinking you need to go to a wider channel width, take a look at the actual utilization of that AP, of that switch. See if it's actually pushing above 100 megabits per second. Because if it's not, there's really no point increasing your channel width beyond 20. So I really, that's another thing. I'm an advocate for 20 megahertz channels. You can use 40 if you need it, but you probably don't need it in a lot of cases. So. Yeah, that's it for my part of the presentation. So what we're going to do now is hand it over to Adam here, and he's going to cover some Q&A and talk about some of the newer features we've introduced.